your white clouds, cielo di Pisa. Out of all this beauty, something must come.
«9 maggio, 14° anno dell'era fascista».
In the final days of World War II, the American poet Ezra Pound was taken into custody near Genoa by the United States Armed Forces. He was charged with treason for making wartime broadcasts from fascist Italy.
He'd begun doing some broadcasts before the war, and I think they were on literary subjects. It was entirely his own idea. The Italians did not ask him to do anything.
He wasn't, by the way, ever bothering or thinking of broadcasting to the troops. In fact, he wasn't even on the radio band that went to the troops in Italy. He was talking to the people whom he thought might throw Roosevelt out of the White House.
I think he was a damn fool. I think he was a literary peacock. He was not a fascist, because a fascist is someone who was close to Mussolini, who believed in what Mussolini was doing. No, let me say, who knew what Mussolini was doing, and who had some share in political power.
Pound was isolated in an iron cage at the American Disciplinary Training Center at Pisa, and then moved to a tent and given access to a typewriter. In his 5 months' confinement at the camp, Pound wrote the Pisan Cantos, 11 sections of an epic poem of the 20th century.
As a lone ant from a broken anthill, from the wreckage of Europe, ego scriptor. The rain has fallen, the wind coming down out of the mountain, Luca forti de marmi.
In one of the radio speeches, for instance, he said, someone was saying, you know, why have you abandoned poetry for economics? And he says, I haven't abandoned poetry. So he continued to write cantos all the time in the back of his mind. I don't think he ever stopped writing cantos. I think that he has written cantos ever since that first ode to the West that he sent to his mother when he was 20.
I was born in Haley, Idaho, near the Sawtooth Range. 5,000 feet above sea level and 5 million miles from anywhere, let alone civilization. I resolved that at 30 I would know more about poetry than any man living. In this search, I learned more or less of 9 foreign languages. I read Oriental stuff in translation. I fought every university regulation and every professor who bothered me with requirements for degrees.
I think Pound showed absolute good sense in going to Europe. He had to go to Europe because he was obsessed with Europe. And try to imagine Pound in New York. Try to imagine Pound in Chicago. It's absurd.
Pound left America in 1908, settling first for 3 months in Venice. He began to absorb the language of Dante and Cavalcanti and the Romanesque architecture of northern Italy. But his great affinity was with the literature of southern France and the spirit of the troubadours.
Practically all the poetry of the modern world arose from 12th century Provence. The Provençal triumph is an art between literature and music. A man may walk the hill roads and river roads from Limoges to Dordogne and learn a little of what the country meant to the wandering singers. He may learn why so many canzos open with speech of the weather and why such a man made war on such and such castles.
Mica bei sobre els prats, tendes e pavidius fermats, e airant alle grazie, gambè per champagne o ringats, xavaliers e xavals armats.
Pound wrote poems in the Provençal form, copying their intricate rhyme schemes. The troubadours helped to provide him with personae, masks, a device he learned from Browning. In one poem, Alta Forte, he took the persona of a warlike knight. There are 6 stanzas, each with 6 lines, and the 6-line endings repeated in each stanza.
Alta Forte, loquitur in Bertrand's de Born. Dante Alighieri put this man in hell because he was a stirrer-up of strife. Judge ye, have I dug him up again? The scene is in his castle Altaforte. Papiol is his jongler, the leopard, the arms of Richard Coeur de Lion. Damn it all this salt stinks peace. You horse and dog, Papiol, come, let's the music. I have no life save when the swords clash. But when I see the standards gold of air, purple opposing, and the broad fields beneath them turn crimson, then howl I my heart nigh mad with rejoicing. In summer have I great rejoicing, when the tempests kill the earth's foul peace, and the lightnings from black heaven flash crimson, and the fierce thunders roar me their music, and the winds shriek through the clouds mad opposing, and through all the riven skies God's odds clash.
He says when he came to England, he was 40 years out of date. And that is, I think, almost an understatement. I think he was at least half a century out of date when he arrived in England. It took a long time to catch up. Several years before he'd even got up to the 90s poets. He did believe before he reached England that Yeats was the only great poet living and went after him.
If you'll read Yeats and Browning and Swinburne and Rossetti, you'll learn something about the progress of English poetry in the last century.
Oh, of course, Rossetti was, in a sense, his father and his mother. It was Rossetti that had first wakened him up to the possibilities of poetry. Pound's teens must have been dominated by the sound of Rossetti and the feeling of Rossetti.
Pound's romantic tastes were shared by Dorothy Shakespeare, a young English painter he met while giving a series of lectures at Regent Street Polytechnic. Dorothy was to become his wife and collaborator, sharing his energies for the new directions of the modernist movement.
A great deal of modernism seems to have gotten underway simultaneously about 1909 or 10. Virginia Woolf said that sometime in December 1910, human nature changed. I don't think it is quite as mysterious as it looks. There was a lot of convergent technology suddenly coming to issue at about that time. The most evident thing that was going on was the electrification of the transport systems of all the big cities of the world almost at once.
Once in Paris, I got out of the metro station and saw suddenly one beautiful face. And then another. And then another. And I tried all day to find words for what that meant to me, and I could not find any words. And that evening there came an equation, not in speech, but in little splotches of color. I realized that if I were a painter, I could found a new school of painting. Painting in splotches of color. I wrote a 30-line poem and destroyed it. 6 months later, I made a poem half that size. A year later, I made this haiku-like sentence. image is the poet's pigment. The image is not an idea. It is a radiant node or cluster, a vortex through which and from which and into which ideas are constantly rushing. It is as true for painting and sculpture as it is for poetry.
Pound borrowed ideas from the other arts. The most dynamic, the most daring innovations were being done in sculpture.
I have written more than once that Gaudier-Brejcha was the most complete case of genius I have ever encountered. Here was the veritable spirit of awakening. The best conversation before World War I was to be found under a railway arch by Putney. And some of my best days, the happiest and the most interesting, were spent in his uncomfortable mud-floored studio.
Sculptural energy is the mountain. Sculptural feeling is the appreciation of masses in relation. Sculptural ability is the defining of these masses by planes.
In one of his poems, The Return, Pound tried to emulate the objective qualities of a Gaudier sculpture.
It looks like a dismembered fragment of Sappho, the way fragments of Sappho look on the page when they're being reproduced from torn parchments. And the left-hand side has been ripped away. That was a way of using the classical heritage that nobody had ever thought of before.
Pre-war Europe was guttering down to its end. The upper strata of society was rotten, trivial, idiotic. In any case, the years immediately before the Great Slaughter were full of exhilaration for those in the middle of the action. All our work was the work of outlaws.
Pound became a leader of the avant-garde, together with Wyndham Lewis and T.E. Hume. It was time for manifestos.